Okay. Right.
We're live, David.
Okay, we ready to go? Okay. So, welcome to section 5, chapter 5, or whatever you want to call it. This is probably, for me, the most difficult part of the Grundrisse. Partly because all kinds of things get jumbled up. There's a lot of discussion that Marx has in his when he puts on what I call his accounting hat, in which he wants 100 units of thalers and 120 thalers, and he does all kinds of little mathematical arithmetic examples, and he works through them incessantly, which is once you've got the main point, it seems a bit odd to spend a lot of time doing that. So he does that. So I'm trying to cut out that sort of stuff. Secondly, in the middle of it, he does a big diversion, and at some point he says, so let's go back to where we were 30 pages before. So the coherence of the argument, if you like, gets disrupted by the fact that he goes down this diversion and then comes back into the main story. So it's hard to work with all of that. And then finally, there are some passages in here which are extremely dense. I cited one of them, which goes on for about 3/4 of a page, one sentence, with all kinds of subordinate clauses and peripheral things and insertions and so on. And when you get to the end of this this passage, you really don't know exactly what to think about any of it. It's very, very difficult to follow. So with all of those things going on, and at the same time, Marx is, I think, trying to open up a pathway into the centerpiece of what the theory of capital is going to be about. So he is trying to do something, but it gets lost in a lot of this turgid stuff and a lot of the peculiar side pieces. But I think that it's useful to start out with where he ends up. And he ends up on page 458, which is where I suggested we stop. And the final paragraph says something which I think is of significance. So let's see where he's going, and then that'll help us, if you like, establish what is important in the materials that have preceded it. As he says here, finally, so there is a sort of final point to his argument, and there is a clear break between this and what happens in the next page or two, where he starts to talk about the real history of capital accumulation. But anyway, this one, it's finally the result of the process of production and realization is, above all, the reproduction and new production of the relation of capital and labor itself, of capitalist and worker. This social relation, production relation, appears in fact as an even more important result of the process than its material results. Notice something here. The social relation is more important than the material. We've encountered this idea before several times, and Marx is always likely to give preference to a discussion of social relations which are immaterial but objective. Remember that. So he's kind of saying, I think the most important thing that we've done is to look at these relations, both material relations and social relations, and of these, the social relation, which is the production relation, is the most important. And more particularly, he goes on to say, within this process, the worker produces himself as labor capacity, as well as the capital confronting him, while at the same time the capitalist produces himself as capital, as well as the living labor capacity confronting him. Each reproduces itself by reproducing its other, its negation. That is, you cannot understand capital without understanding its negation, which is labor. And you cannot understand labor without understanding its negation, which is capital. Each reproduces itself by reproducing its other, its negation. The capitalist produces labor as alien. Labor produces the product as alien. Remember, he's earlier established that really he's looking at the relationship between alien capital and alien labor. The capitalist produces the worker, and the worker the capitalist. They produce each other. So he's brought the argument to this point, and therefore what we have to do is not to see the worker and capital are somehow separate, which are then brought together and collapsed together, but they are each other's negation. And that goes back to the theory and argument he's making about how realization connects to production. So I'm going to go through what I think are perhaps the most significant elements in this. I'm going to use, because this has got too tattered and torn to be usable, and but anyway, but I'm going to use the my accounting in the book. One of the things that Marx does at the very outset here is to start to talk about this coming together of capital and labor and how each internalizes the other. And one of the first points he makes is that what he sees from all of the arithmetic cases, and when he opens this whole passage, he says he's done with tedious calculations, and he then gives us another 10 pages of tedious calculations. But then out of these comes something which is rather significant, which is the relationship between the fact that the less necessary labor produces more surplus labor. And this relationship between necessary labor and surplus labor is very much about the question of time allocation. So he talks about the question of time allocation within production emerges step by step, leading Marx to the following conclusion. Just as capital on one side creates surplus labor is at the same time equally the presupposition of the existence of capital. The whole development of wealth rests on the creation of disposable time. The idea that wealth is measured in disposable time as opposed to monetary or some other form of power is important. It implies that a hallmark of socialism, remember, this is important here in the sense that Marx rarely kind of says, hey, this is about socialism, but here he is saying something. It implies that a hallmark of socialism is a proper distribution of wealth measured as disposable time. Okay, so one of the features of a socialist society then is one in which everybody will have a great deal of disposable time, and necessary time will be taken care of very quickly. And in volume 3 of Capital, Marx made the kind of comment that the realm of freedom begins when the realm of necessity is left behind. That necessary labor is something which would have to be done, but that free labor time and doing whatever you want is the hallmark of a capitalist, of a socialist society. But disposable here is the fact that the disposable time, which is being generated by relative surplus value, that disposable time is being used to produce surplus value for capital. So, in a sense, surplus labor time, surplus value, is in principle disposable time in a socialist society. If we abolished capital and abolished the appropriation of that time for surplus value, then that time which is currently being used to produce surplus value would be free time. Just do what you want. You wouldn't need surplus value because surplus value is producing the capitalist class. And if you're going to abolish the capitalist class, you're not going to need surplus value, and they're not going to appropriate surplus value. So all of that surplus labor time can be then actually claimed back, clawed back, if you like, by the laborer and the laborers, so that this then is, if you like, what socialism might be about. So this is an interesting kind of little observation. As he says in the next sentence, that a hallmark of socialism is a proper distribution measured in disposable time. Under the regime of capital, disposable time is converted into surplus labor time. And that is sort of interesting, and it was that got Marx out of finally doing all of these kind of little calculations. So that's the first point that he makes in this section. The second point is this, that Marx, and this bottom of page 153 in the Companion, Marx then shows it is the law of, or tendency of capital to create as much labor as possible. Now, this is going to become a theme of great importance, and you should never let go of this idea that this is a law of capital, a foundational law of capital, to create as much labor as possible, just as it is equally its tendency to reduce necessary labor to a minimum. It is therefore equally a tendency of capital to increase the laboring population, as well as constantly to posit a part of it as surplus population. And now we're getting to, okay, surplus time, surplus labor time. There's going to be a surplus labor population, which in a sense is not going to be employed. So in a sense, it is also taking up that positionality of disposable time. But again, it's going to be used in a certain kind of way for the benefit of capital. Then Marx goes on to say, here, and this is going back to the idea that you're trying to create as much labor as possible, the relation between population growth and the accumulation of capital, as well as the role of relative surplus population or industrial reserve army, becomes critical. And I quote from Marx, "It is equally a tendency of capital to make human labor relatively superfluous, so as to drive it as human labor towards infinity." Now, what exactly Marx means by that, I can't figure out. You can go guess it for yourself. But if value is nothing but objectified labor, and surplus labor is objectified labor beyond that required for necessary labor, then capital has to produce more and more surplus. And this it can only do if it multiplies the number of laborers employed. The other tactic focuses on the working day, which is by extending the working day that you actually capture more and more of the surplus labor time and create more surplus labor time by working people for longer and longer, 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, and the like. So he then talks about this. Hence, he says, the tendency of capital simultaneously to increase the laboring population, as well as to reduce constantly its necessary part. And the increase of population itself is the chief means for reducing the necessary part. These are the sorts of things that get considered in all our arithmetic example. How many hours goes to the laborer, how much hours goes to necessary, what is, all of these things. But here he reduces it to a simple thing. Now, there's a great deal said in the next 2 or 3 pages about demographics and the importance of population. Again, I want to say that this is one of the neglected themes in the examination of Marx's thinking. It's a neglected theme, I suspect, for a number of reasons. One is that Marx really couldn't stand Malthus. And the whole theory of overpopulation, which was coming up in Malthus' theory of population and so on, was totally obnoxious as far as Marx was concerned. And Marx Marx had great respect for Ricardo. You never saw kind of cussing out Ricardo or Adam Smith and Stewart and so on. But when it comes to Malthus, Marx is unlikely to use very polite language. He doesn't like Malthus at all. And of course, Malthus was essentially explaining the existence of poverty in Britain at that time was due to overpopulation. The working class produced too many kids, and overpopulation there, and that they were behaving in an animalistic way, which is they weren't controlling their desires and their sexual appetites, and they were having very large families, and this was the nature of the problem. So yeah, Marx is fiercely opposed to that. But that doesn't mean that the demographics are irrelevant, because what he's saying here is that capital needs more and more labor power. And over time, it therefore is necessary that there be population growth. And there's been positive population growth right throughout the historical era of capitalism. In recent times, however, that positive population growth has started to be clawed back a bit. And there are now about 50 or 60 countries in the world which had negative rates of population growth, which would have been unthinkable in Marx's time. The most recent one, and one which is being discussed, is China. China went for a one-child policy back around 1980, and as a result of that, the labor force, which was huge in 1980 because of the increasing life expectancy in the Mao period, the radical decline in infant mortality, so that when China came upon the world stage, it came marching into global capitalism with a huge population, a huge labor force. And it used that labor force to actually insert itself into the global economy. And the labor force was cheap. It was partially educated, significantly disciplined, and therefore, the China growth syndrome, which set in after 1980, had almost everything to do with the fact that China had this huge relative advantage in terms of labor supply. And because of the one-child policy, over the last 10 or 15 years, that advantage is disappearing. And in fact, now the age pyramid in China is the younger age group is much smaller, and China is now one of those countries which has a negative rate of population. As you probably know, India has recently overtaken China as the most populous country in the world. So these centers of population and potential labor supply, like India, Indonesia, Nigeria, watch out for where capital goes in the future, because they're the big pools of labor supply, which have not yet been brought into this negative population growth. But what actually you're seeing, if you say, what are the countries which are in economic trouble around the world? Well, Japan has had an extremely low rate of growth, and Japan's demographics have been appalling. But not only has Japan had a very low rate of population growth, in fact, it's not growing at all. It's negative. Also, it's been hostile to immigration. So the two sources of labor supply in Japan are not there. So Japan has been having a very hard time of it. And now many people can say, but Japanese industry is doing fine. Well, the answer is yes, Japanese industry is doing very fine, but mainly because during the 1980s, Japanese industry and the corporations offshored. Actually, much of the growth in China was Japanese corporations going into China and mopping up the labor supply in China. So if you look at the situation, the demographics are terribly important. And Marx is kind of saying, yeah, these demographics are terribly important, and we have to look to them. He doesn't deal with it very much because at that time, pretty much everywhere, to the degree that it had a sort of positive population figures, was the high rates of population growth. So he's not sort of discussing it very strongly. And here I also point out that immigration is partly involved in this. And I find it very interesting these days that when you look back at the 1960s, which I'm old enough to remember very well, the Germans were importing Turkish labor. The French government was actually subsidizing the import of Maghrebian labor. The Swedes were using Yugoslavia and Portuguese labor. The British were using the British Empire and then there was a big Reform Act in the United States in 1965, which opened up the United States to immigration, not from those favored countries in Europe, which were not growing very fast, but to the whole world of immigration. So immigration plus population growth is terribly important. And I think that one of the things that we need to look at today is to expand if you like, what Marx is saying in these few changes and say, well, capital needs labor. It needs more labor. Actually, the world wage labor force has increased by about 1 billion since 1980. It's gone from 2 to 3 billion. It was a huge increase in the global wage labor force in recent times. And that is partly the demographics, partly also other things about it, immigration. And also, as one of the things that I mentioned, is that the bringing of women into the labor force has been a major factor. All of those possibilities are now over, and we've got, of course, a great deal of hostility within resident populations to immigration. And one of the things that Angela Merkel ran into when the Syria problem came, Angela Merkel welcomed 1 million refugees from Syria. And she did it and was explicit about it because Germany needs the labor. But, of course, the right wing and the anti-immigrant faction got on and gave her a hell of a time. And in some ways, she stepped down as chancellor, in part, I think, because of the antagonism that came with this policy towards the Syrians and importing 1 million people from, making refugees of 1 million people from Syria. So this issue that comes up in Marx is an important one, and Marx clearly recognizes it as important. He doesn't discuss it very much, but one of the things that I'm trying to emphasize with you, going through the Grundrisse, is there are times when Marx raises something which is terribly important and leaves it there, and it's our job to expand upon it a bit where I am over these demographics. So the demographics, keep the demographics very much in mind, and so when you're reading the newspapers and you're reading stuff about, Chinese labor or something like that, remember the demographics. It's shifting, it's changing, and as I said earlier, right now I'd be looking at it and saying, well, if demographics are still important, then you go to those parts of the world where there are demographic surpluses. And this is, particularly India, but also Nigeria. Much of sub-Saharan Africa is a labor reserve, if you like, vast, as yet largely untapped labor reserve, where capital will, I think, be drawn to at a certain point. And you can already see signs of that in cities like Lagos and so on. Now, the third point is this. In Marx's time, the demographic question was not very much in the fore of things. But in a footnote, he noted something important. The creation of surplus labor on the one side corresponds to the creation of minus labor, relative idleness, on the other. A whole army of workers live not from capital, but from revenue. And Marx is very contemptuous of this service class. He calls them paupers, flunkies, and lickspittles, along with a whole train of retainers. He didn't like the lumpenproletariat. He was appalled by them. He actually said some rather appalling things about them. But, there we are. He was a person of his time. And he was not at all enthusiastic about the flunkies and the lickspittles. But the point he's making here is that the working class, which is producing value, is becoming so productive that it can support a larger and larger element of unproductive labor, which is absorbed into surpluses, employment, for the upper classes, and that therefore Marx doesn't talk about this a lot, but it raises an interesting kind of question that you might want to think about. If more and more of the population is engaged in unproductive labor, like chauffeurs for Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or someone like that, if more and more labor is employed in those kinds of things, and you're looking to labor as being the big mobilizing force towards socialism, then what does that labor do? What is it about politically? Is that labor, and a lot of that labor, it seems to me, doesn't go for socialism at all. It's more likely to go for sort of right-wing fascism and so on. But Marx is kind of suggesting here we have to look at the relationship between that labor, which is really central into the production of value in society and where real growth is going on, and a lot of this other labor. And he handles this in this footnote. This is an issue which, for our present time, when we start to think about the question of who is going to be politically active, who is likely to be what are the demographic characteristics of the population which would lead major elements of it to rally to the cause of creating a socialist society. And are there some who are more prone to that and some who are more prone to be actively against it? I think these are the sorts of issues which come up in this section. Which then leads into the big issue, which is the question of realization. And let me quote now from him. We have now seen how, in the realization process, capital has first maintained its value by means of exchange with living labor. Second, created a surplus value. And third, that he says the realization process of capital, and money becomes capital only through the realization process, appears at the same time as its devaluation process, its demonetization. What he's beginning to talk about here now is the whole complex issue of the realization of value in that. Remember, go back to that picture of the realization process of capital in general. Money is realized in the form of labor supply and means of production. It's taken into production, it produces a commodity. The value of that commodity is realized by a seller in the market, and that realizes both the value of the original commodity, which are imported, the value of the labor power, and the surplus value, which then feeds back. So this is a spiral form which emerges around that. And you start to look at that and you kind of say, well, okay, you see where production is located, where Marx is located. It's in the labor process. Okay. But then there's a realization process where the money has to be realizable as labor power and as commodities, and those have to be realizable in production. And so realization is going on both in production and in circulation. And if I cut the long story short, one of the things that's going to come out of this is the following: that there is no value without realization. That capital and value depends upon a unity between production and realization. If you work at something and you make a commodity and you can't sell it, the commodity has no value. Value depends entirely upon both production and realization. There's a tendency in the Marxist history to fetishize production and then say, well, realization. No, they are equally important. You cannot have realization without production. You can't have production without realization. And therefore what Marx does is to say value depends on the contradictory unity of production and realization. This is the critical thing that he's going to come up with. If there's no realization, there's no value. So he's then got to start to talk. In Capital, of course, he talks an immense amount about production. Right towards the end, he says something interesting. He said, we assume all commodities sell at their value, trade at their value. And that's the assumption of Volume 1. There is no problem of realization. You don't have to discuss realization in Volume 1 of Capital. You don't have to discuss it because it's assumed away. It's assumed all commodities exchange at their value. Realization is okay. Now, what Marx is saying here is it's not okay. There are lots of issues here, lots of barriers, and he starts to talk about all kinds of barriers and all kinds of difficulties of realization. And that's why even when he says that value depends upon the unity of production and realization, that assumes that all of the difficulties which exist in the field of realization have been overcome. And so what then follows throughout this section is a real lengthy discussion of all the possible barriers that exist in the field of realization. And one of the things that immediately comes up is the threat of devaluation. And there are two forms that devaluation can take according to this. One is you lose the value entirely, all right? You make something, you take it to market, and you can't sell it. And in the end, you just throw it away or you burn it or something like that. What then is lost? Not only the labor that's been put into it, both potentially as surplus value and as necessary, but also all of the constant capital, that's lost. So in effect, when the commodity has been produced through the labor process and the commodity is taken into the marketplace, you face always the threat of devaluation. You could not sell it, in which case you've got devaluation. You've lost the value. You may partially lose the value because if you take the commodity to market and you want, $20 for it and you can't sell it, and then at the end of the day you say, all right, give me $7 and you can have it, and somebody gives you $7, well, in that case, it's a partial devaluation. You maybe just got back the raw materials you put into it, but you don't get back anything for the labor. So then the question arises, well, what is it that may be a real threat? And Marx kind of says this in the following sort of way. You have to imagine that a lot of commodities, when they go on the market, are potentially devalued. In effect, their value is resurrected when they're sold. So he starts to use this notion that the transitions that go on from this to that point are moments of potential devaluation. You could fail to make the journey from commodity to money or from money into commodity. And if you can't make that journey, you lost. So basically what he's kind of ending up with is a kind of idea like this, that everything that goes in there is devalued and then is resurrected by some action. So that it's not as if devaluation comes from outside. Marx is always against the idea that you have to rely on things outside of capital. No, devaluation is always implicit in the circulation of capital. It's always implicit in the possibility that you would make something which could not be sold. or could only be sold at an inferior price. All of those things. It's all of those things. So Marx then is going into realization and starts to say, well, we have to understand devaluation as being part and parcel of what this is about. And there are a series of barriers. And initially, Marx Marx treats of realization in production as well as in circulation. There's a realization problem in production. Production can break down. So that the money capital that you've got, which has purchased the raw materials and the machines, can be taken into the production process, and let's suppose the machine breaks down. Then the capital is lost. So you could lose it in the moment of production. So capital has to be realized not only in the market, in circulation, it has to be realized in production. Now, that failure to realize and devaluation in production itself is not taken up in much great detail in Marx, but you have to have it in your mind when you're thinking about it. What you really have to do however, is to spend a lot of time looking at the potentiality of devaluation, loss of value, and inability to realize value in the market. And there are all sorts of issues which crop up. At this point, Marx is talking about various barriers. And, okay, on 159 of the Companion, I cite Marx as follows. Inside the production process, realization appeared totally identical with the production of surplus labor, and hence appeared to have no bounds except those posited within it as barriers to be forcibly overcome. But there now appear barriers to it which lie outside it. The commodity must be a use value to somebody somewhere. All right? First condition. You've got to produce something that's a use value for somebody. Somebody's going to want to use it for some reason or other. And that's the first barrier. And that first barrier is therefore consumption itself, the need for it, the state of wants, needs, and desires. Now, if you remember the diagram, I kind of said, okay, wants, needs, and desires come out of human culture and all the rest of it, and they're part and parcel of living. So in order for there to be effective demand for commodities and a use value, there has to be wants, needs, and desires. The shaping and reshaping of wants, needs, and desires becomes absolutely critical in the history of capital. Before you were born, did you have a desire for a cell phone? No, of course not. I lived in a world where there were no cell phones, where there was no internet, there were no computers. Wow. Did I desire all those things all along? No, my wants, needs, and desires have been completely reshaped by the kind of society I'm living in, and yours have been shaped entirely by the society you're living in. So, and this is not only wants, needs, and desires, it's need backed by ability to pay. Since capital is perpetually creating new value, and then here I quote Marx, it seems indeed as if no equivalent were available for it. Capital, when entering circulation, appears to encounter barrier in the available magnitude of consumption capacity. Okay, this is important concept. Consumption capacity. That's the first barrier. If there's not the consumption capacity, you can produce anything you like, and there's no value. And it's going to be devalued. You're going to lose the value. This barrier, Marx says, is intensified because use value does not have the boundlessness of value. How many pairs of shoes can you have? versus how much monetary value can you accumulate. There was the famous case of Imelda Marcos. When the revolution came and they went into her cupboard, they found 6,000 pairs of shoes, which is pretty good, right? I mean, but still there's a limit. There's 6,000. It's not 60,000 or 60 billion, you know. Whereas you can get $60 billion, you can't get 60 billion shoes. Wouldn't fit on planet Earth. So this consumption use value does not have a boundlessness of value. So the commodity has to have a use value. And the use value is not infinite. It can't be infinite. So there's a potential barrier here because capital needs to take its spiral form and have an infinite growth. So you've got a prospect of infinite growth against a limited capacity in terms of consumption capacity. Therefore, there's likely to be a crisis of some kind. You're going to get overproduction. The main point here, says Marx, is that we're concerned with the general since we are concerned with the general concept of capital, is that the general concept of capital depends upon this unity of production and realization. Not immediately, that is, they're not on top of each other, but as a process which is linked to certain conditions. So we're getting now to the recognition that this unity of production and realization is there. Realization depends on production capacity, on consumption capacity, and that is limited. Now, what Marx then kind of says is, well, you have to find ways to get around it. And one of the ways is to create the world market. And here Marx kind of says it depends on what kind of capital you are, you know, what kind of surplus value you're creating as to what you got to do. So I'll quote him. The creation of absolute surplus value is conditional upon a constant expansion of the sphere of circulation. The surplus value created at one point requires the creation of surplus value at another point. A constantly widening sphere of circulation is thus a necessary condition for the survival of capital. As a result, the tendency to create the world market is directly given in the concept of capital itself. This is Marx writing in 1858. He's saying, okay, you've got this mode of production. It's going to create the world market. In 1858, he saw that. He saw the world, and have we created the world market? Has the history of capital been about the creation of the world market? You bet it has. I mean, is Marx kind of saying absolute surplus value says you're going to get a world market and you better hurry. What Marx seems to be asserting here is the contradiction of need and effective demand and how that can be expanded. And that is going to be expanded by much more interlinkage on the world market. On the other side, he says, the production of relative surplus value, that is, surplus value based on the increase and development of the productive forces, requires the production of new consumption, requires that the consuming circle within circulation expands, as did the productive circle previously. Firstly, quantitative expansion of existing consumption. That's what the colonial enterprise was often about. Quantitative expansion of British textile industry into the Indian market. So, firstly, quantitative expansion of existing consumption. Secondly, creation of new needs by propagating existing ones in a wide circle. Okay, new needs, like transportation, take that one. Steam engine, the internal combustion engine, the jet engine. Thirdly,
production of new needs and discovery and creation of new use values. Well, we've been very good at that. In other words, so that the surplus labour gain does not remain entirely a merely quantitative surplus, but rather constantly increases the circle of qualitative differences within labour. This is all written in 1858. It says, you go with capitalist mode of production, this is what you're going to get. Now, is this what we've got, and what we've gotten, and what we're still getting? The answer is, I think anyway, yes. You may think it's not, but there we are. This means that the capitalist mode of production has revolutionary qualities in the sphere not only of production, but of consumption and in consumption capacity. And here's how Marx describes that. Hence, exploration of all of nature in order to discover new, useful qualities of things. Universal exchange of the products of all alien climates and lands. New artificial preparation of natural objects by which they are given new use values. The exploration of the earth in all directions to discover new things of use as well as new useful qualities of the old, such as new qualities of them as raw materials, etc. The development, hence, of the natural sciences to their highest point. Likewise, the discovery, creation and satisfaction of new needs arising from society itself. The cultivation of all the qualities of the social human being, production of the same in a form as rich as possible in needs, because rich in qualities and relations. Production of this being as the most total and universal possible social product. For in order to take gratification in a many-sided way, we must be capable of many pleasures, hence cultured to a high degree. Again, you can talk about, the whole history of capitalism and say, well, you see a good deal of this in it. This, he says, is a condition of production founded on capital. So this is him taking off, and this is these brilliant moments where Marx takes off and says, "Well, look at this, see how it goes. This is what you're going to get." So there is a constantly expanding and constantly enriched system of needs being created, and from this follows. This goes back to that mission statement about we've got to understand what capital is. Thus, capital creates the bourgeois society and the universal appropriation of nature as well as of the social bond itself by the members of society. Hence, the great civilizing influence of capital, we come across this theme of civilizing influence before, is production of a stage of society in comparison to which all earlier ones appear as mere local developments of humanity and as nature idolatry. For the first time, nature becomes purely an object for humankind, purely a matter of utility, ceases to be recognized as a power for itself, and the theoretical discovery of its autonomous laws appears merely as a ruse so as to subjugate it under human needs, whether as an object of consumption or as a means of production. In accord with this tendency, capital drives beyond national barriers and prejudices, as much as beyond nature worship, as well as beyond all traditional, confined, complacent, encrusted satisfactions of present needs and reproductions of old ways of life. Capital is destructive towards all of this and constantly revolutionizes it, tearing down all the barriers which hem in the development of the forces of production, the expansion of needs, the all-sided development of production, and the exploitation and exchange of natural and mental forces. Again, this was written in 1858. And while you may object, as I do to a certain degree, about the rather domination of nature thesis, it is still the case that even though we like to think that we're more sensitive ecologically than we used to be,
that we're still very much into the thing of wanting to absolutely dominate. And when certain things come along, like, viruses and things like that, you want to dominate it. You don't want to. So there's okay. There are questions to be asked here, but on the other hand, this is a very extremely interesting set of ideas which Marx is producing, which have to do with the necessity of a continuous expansion of the capacity for consumption. You cannot have a capitalist society without that capacity. This leads into the possibility and the potentiality for the development of certain crises. And then Marx gets into some ideas about crisis formation. Can you have overaccumulation? Are you going to produce too much? What does it mean to say too much? Is the too much because you produce too much, or is it too much because there's not effective demand amongst the population? This is one of the things that is going to come up a little bit, because you can see emerging a contradiction. If you want to restrict the value of labor power, then the consumption capacity of the working classes is going to be restricted also. And if the consumption capacity of the working classes is restricted, then what's going to happen to this law of continuous expansion of use values? Where's the demand coming from? Malthus, who Marx tended to denigrate, came up with the idea that it was terribly important for society to have a class of conspicuous consumers, because then that would equalize the problem that arose from the fact that the poor were so poor, and therefore were not actually generating a great deal of consumption capacity. You needed a bunch of people to go around, and actually Malthus starts to talk about consuming classes. And you can kind of say, well, what does the church do? What does the state do? What do the real ultra-rich do? Well, it's amazing the number of super yachts that have been around, those sorts of things. So conspicuous consumption. And it's also Thorsten Veblen later on sort of started talking about the politics of the leisure class. So Marx is a little bit sympathetic to that and kind of says, well, actually, there's a tremendous amount of a consumption that goes on around here that has nothing to do with production at all, and it has nothing to do with actually the reproduction of a working class. It has everything to do with the reproduction of a bourgeoisie, or a reproduction of a clerical class and a state employment class and all the rest of it. And so this is some of the things which are very important to look at. So beyond this, though, we come back to, and I quote this on page 166, which is page 414 and 15 in the original, where Marx talks about the contradictory unity of production and realization within the totality. And then I quote him as follows: to approach the matter more closely, first of all, there is a limit, not inherent to production generally, but to production founded on capital. And that limit is twofold. To begin with, there are inherent limits. Necessary labor depends on existing labor capacity and the wage level. That's a limitation. Surplus value limits surplus labor time. Transformation into money may be constricted by lack of effective demand. The search for exchange value may restrict the production of use values.
But these limits are confronted with the general tendency of capital to expand. Hence, overproduction and general devaluation in response to capital's tendency to drive beyond all barriers. Capital is at the same time thereby faced with the task of launching its attempt anew from a higher level of the development of productive forces, with each time greater collapse as capital. Clear, therefore, that the higher the development of capital, the more it appears as barrier to production, hence also to consumption, besides the other contradictions which make it appear as burdensome barrier to production and intercourse. So the realization is problematic, and he starts to go through, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but in the next page, I go on. The point here, Marx says, is not yet to develop overproduction, but only the predisposition to it. And then he goes on to talk about the possessing and consuming classes that play a distinctive role. And in recent times, there's been a revival of interest in the rentier and rentier capitalism, which is unproductive activities, which have a very important role to play, not in production so much, but in the realm of consumption. That the rentiers are just absolutely consuming like anything. But then also he comes back to look in much more detail on the role of the workers as consumers. And to some degree, you find the following situation, that the workers themselves are, of course, consumers. And Marx has a very interesting kind of comment here, that when you look at them as consumers, you start to see something very, very different about them. And he says something interesting about it. He says, their role is extinguished as workers. When they're workers, they're consumers. They're working in the workplace, that's one thing. When they're in the supermarket shopping, they're consumers. And the relationship is between consumers and producers. And therefore, working class consumption has to be understood and analyzed in a different kind of way in terms of this role of consumption and so on. But here's an interesting kind of commentary. Every single capitalist wants to reduce the value of the labor power they employ as much as they possibly can to keep wages down, to maximize their surplus value. Okay? But then every capitalist needs a market. So every capitalist wants all the other capitalists to raise wages because that's their market. They themselves will reduce it. Here's the these are the sorts of contradictions that Marx relishes. That individual capitalists, acting in their own self-interest, are going to depress the value of labor power and the wage level to such a degree that you're going to inhibit consumption, and you're going to get an underconsumption problem. Actually, look at the data. And what you find is that the share of wages in national income since 1980 steadily declined in almost every major country in the world. Which means that wages are less and less. Then Marx says something very interesting. Of course, you can compensate, he says, by borrowing money and resorting to credit. What's happened since 1980? The share of wages in national income has gone down. The credit activities of working people have shot up. So you've got, again, that contradiction, which produces a sort of response, which in itself then starts to be a problem because working classes are so indebted right now that they spend all of their time working off their debts. And since we're indebting students at the same time, you know, we've immediately got all sorts of issues. So Marx is going through all of these issues about realization. And what I tried to do was to summarize a lot of these and to recognize that the relationship between production and realization is a contradictory unity, and that therefore we should be paying as much attention to the creation of new wants and needs, the manipulation of wants, needs and desires, the creation of effective demand through policies towards wage labour, the collectivization of some consumption activities through state apparatuses, the collectivization through healthcare, education, things of those kinds, so all sorts of things of this kind. So what Marx is doing then is in these passages doing, I think, a rather wonderful job of summarizing most of the issues that arise out of this contradictory unity between production and realization. And then we ask ourselves about our own society and say, to what degree are the sorts of things he's talking about back in 1858 relevant for us today? And given the passages I've read to you, I think you can see straight away that they're deeply relevant. But Marx is saying something beyond, well, okay, I'm very good at predicting what's going on in the world. I'm a kind of a seer. You know? No. What he's saying is that this is what a capitalist mode of production is about. This is how capital works. These are the rules, if you like, of the game under a capitalist mode of production. You adopt a capitalist mode of production, and to the degree that a capitalist mode of production has become dominant, hegemonic, then this is the kind of result that's going to come from it. This is a brilliant piece of theorizing, right? I mean, he's building the theory of a capitalist mode of production and then projecting from it into what exactly the end point of that capitalist mode of production is progressing towards. And why I find it so fascinating to look at this is that Marx not only does this, you know, in relationship to his own time and to future times, but he does it theoretically and with theoretical kind of background, and yet you can see the elements of what's going on in society around us are very much along these lines. And then you are asking the question, well, what are we going to do about it? Which is why I like these little snippets like, yeah, disposable time. Yeah, we're creating a lot of disposable time, but all of that disposable time is being taken up by the production of surplus value for capital. All of that disposable time is being absorbed by the oligarchy, by the top 1%. The top 1% is absorbing all of that surplus labor time, which, if it was evenly distributed, would create a rather wonderful life for everybody. But you can't. So that you can play with what he's doing, and see at the same time. You start to worry a lot about where we're headed when he starts to go, well, absolute surplus value requires this, and relative surplus value requires that. The world market is a done deed as soon as you get into the capitalist mode of production. You know, and all of these other elements which you're beginning to look at, the manipulation of one's needs and desires and the like, are all there. So you can read this and sort of project it into the current situation and say, this is a very interesting way to sort of conceptualize where we're at right now. And all of this, of course, is also caught up in the tendency to create crises. And you can see straight away various crises beginning to crystallize out, possibility of crises, and the prospect of devaluation. And you kind of go, interesting.
They were talking about devaluation, and we've got two banks where they just devalued a huge amount of shareholder capital. But then do what's interesting, all of the crises that Marx talks about here occur. What is the response of the powers that be? Flood the world with liquidity. With the result that, of course, the total amount of money in the world has been shooting up, debt has been shooting up. You get out of it by creating one massive Ponzi scheme. And then you're kind of concerned with, well, how do you manipulate wants, needs, and desires in such a way as to be consistent with the perpetuation of a Ponzi scheme? You know, there are all sorts of interesting questions of this kind. So this is, for me, there are several other aspects of here, but this is, I think, for me, the one key aspect of the Grundrisse where my argument that, you know, you find these real gems of insights in the midst of kind of this pretty turgid stuff here, if you want to go through it all. I gather that the Marxist Educational Project here is going through it page by page. And they've been at it for 2 years or 3 years now. And I mean, must go talk to them, see how much they found out by spending time on all those passages that I've brushed over. But you can explore them too, so it's up to you. Okay, any questions people want to pose? I think I need the... We have a question.
Hiya. So I'm curious about the role of monopolies in terms of regulating some of the crisis tendencies of capitalism and contradictions between production and consumption. If you could talk about it, or if Marx has touched on that.
Yeah, one of the things I didn't do here was that Marx does talk about competition and the importance of the coercive laws of competition in driving much of this, which then automatically raises the question of monopolies and how they work. What I think is actually rather interesting to look at, however, is to not take a very simple view of what constitutes a monopoly. The theory of monopoly capital, as it was laid out by Moran and Sweezy, typically looked at Detroit, and of course Detroit was not a monopoly. It was really an oligopoly. I mean, you had 3 firms, and they were, to some degree, dominant in US society, but they were protected in the US market by the Bretton Woods system, which prevented capital mobility, restricted capital mobility. If you look at the Detroit monopoly, and then look at what happened to it after 1980, after you had opened up and abolished capital controls, then of course Detroit suddenly finds itself in a total competitive mess with the Japanese and the German, and then later on the Korean, South Korean auto companies. So while we're likely to look at monopoly power in Big Pharma, the Seven Sisters, you're always looking at actually not monopoly in the sense of a pure monopoly. You're looking at an oligopoly where a few very large firms in competition with each other. Look at pharmaceuticals, for example. So what we often refer to as a centralization tendency of capital rarely produces a situation of an absolute monopoly. And when there is an absolute monopoly, there is always a strong element of state regulation. So that when you get what Adam Smith called natural monopolies, which are transport systems or water systems or something of that kind, if they are under municipal control and state control, that's one thing, but many of them are privatized, but they're privatized with the restriction that there is some kind of regulatory mechanism which exists to make sure that they don't abuse their monopoly power. Now, that's sometimes corrupted and often corrupted. But in most parts of the world, there are, in the United States, for example, there's anti-monopoly legislation, anti-monopoly law. The same is true in Europe. Europe is more stringent about the operation of that law. The United States is very, very weak about it. So I want to get away from the idea that there's something called monopoly here, which is pure monopoly. It's very rare that you have pure monopoly. There's always some level of competition, orchestrated competition between, for instance, even the big three car firms in the 1960s. Having said that, clearly, one of the things that does happen is that corporate power is extensive in certain areas, and a few companies can control the media, can control seed plasmas, can control all kinds of things. So that this means that the coercive laws of competition are much reduced in their force, and competition actually can sometimes play a very important role in terms of new consumerist forms. And what we've seen, however, internalized within what are close to monopoly structures is a great deal of competition. For example, some of the large computer companies decentralize their research units and put them in competition with each other. They internalize competition within the corporation. So you have a very large corporation that has a great deal of monopoly power, but the competition is preserved by setting up several competitive units within the corporation who are competing in the development of new products, new ideas, new everything. So the competition is preserved, but internalized within the corporation, and you will find other things of that kind. For instance, the development of research labs which engage in technological reorganization, competition between research universities for breakthroughs in certain kinds of research. And if you look at something like cancer research, that's organized a great deal with a great deal of monopoly power, but there's a great deal of internalization of competition. So I would want to say that that we never get in a situation of pure monopoly power. We never get in a situation of pure coercive competition. What we do is we have usually this kind of area in which there are certain kinds of competitive forms which are restructured and built around certain monopoly powers. In China, for example, one of the things that surprised me when going in China was to find how competitive everything is. You expect that somehow or other there's a dictator and, Xi dictates and it all flows down. It's not like that at all. there are only certain things that can get dictated. There's a great deal of local autonomy, a great deal of local competitiveness, and a great deal of competition, also organized sometimes through private companies, but other times through state companies. The competition within the banking system is entirely under centralized, is a centralized monopoly controls structure. So how monopoly and competition get organized, and the various periods when things seem to be more monopolistic than other periods which seem to be more competitive. There's a bit of toing and froing between that historically, and also from one place to another. For instance, there's a good deal of monopoly power within the German system. If you look at other places, and you look at the economy of Hong Kong, for example, before the takeover, it was highly competitive. So there's a great deal of variation also between the degree of cooperation and monopoly power. So it's an important thing. One of the things Marx does here is to talk about how the relationship between production and realization is structured around competitive forces. So competitive forces take on, and it doesn't consider what you're asking for, which is the role that the relative forms of competition which we have might affect that history. And I think that is something that needs to be looked at, and I think that's a really good topic.
Hi, Professor. It just occurred to me when we were through that part about use value doesn't have the boundlessness of value. When I think about museum artifacts, arts basically, I think they do for me like hold that sense of eternal value. Like they can be viewed for ages to come, and somehow. Also, you mentioned the 6,000 pairs of shoes, like the same kind of logic of building up collections is invading into so many families, like not only rich households, like the 6,000 pairs of shoes, but also if you check YouTube videos, there are a lot of girls sharing, I have this, I'm showing this 10 pairs of my collection of shoes. Like that logic is invading a lot more households. Yeah. And I feel that sense of boundlessness of use value to some extent as well. It just occurred to me.
Well, the boundlessness of the desire is one thing. And capital is very good at trying to mobilize that. The idea of infinite happiness via consumerism. So yes, that is there, but I think there are various facets of consumerism which are responding to this boundlessness impulse. It's not an impulse, but requirement in a way. And one of the things I would notice is to say that what does capital produce? Well, all the time it produced shoes and things and cars and so on. It's one thing. But increasingly since 1980 or so, it has become very much caught up in the production of events, of experiences. And so I kind of look at something like a cruise liner, what is being produced. So think of the economy of a cruise liner. It's very, somebody surely is doing research on this, but the economy of a cruise liner is great. See, you have a labor force, I don't know, sometimes as many as 2,000 people employed on the cruise liner. You have, I don't know, 3,000 or 4,000 guests who are there for, I don't know, 10 days, just there for the experience. And you try to organize lots of mini experiences. You subcontract with all kinds of people to set up restaurants and bars and entertainments and blah, 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 you know. So cruise liner becomes the fixed capital is enormous. Right? The power and the energy down in the engine room is kind of a bit like the capitalist mode of production is pushing the thing forward forever. So you kind of go, well, if I put myself back in the 1960s and somebody described life on a cruise liner, I think they were crazy. Though, having crossed the Atlantic 3 or 4 times in the 1960s and 1970s on an ocean liner, I could get the point. It was a great experience. I enjoyed it. But consider now all of the, the World Cup, the competitions, the Olympics, all of those sorts of things. Look at go back and look at the historical record of what the Olympics looked like back in the 1960s compared to what they look like now, compared to what they did. I mean, again, it's the mobilization of spectacle as a form of consumption, which is instantaneously over. Well, it's not instantaneous, 100 meters is over in, I don't know, 9 seconds or whatever it is. So again, there are forms of consumerism, the Netflix economy, if you like, which is very, very different. And a lot of capital now goes into the production of spectacles. And a lot of consumerism is caught up in the world of spectacle because it's instantaneously over. I'm in the habit of still wearing some of my 1960s shirts. My daughter thinks it's ridiculous. But if you just, I'm waiting. At some point or other, there's going to be a retro period where they become fashionable, and I'll be great, But this is the world where we again, just reading Marx and realizing the kinds of forces that he's saying are going to be mobilized in terms of a capitalist mode of production and what it's about and how it's going and where it's going, seems to me to be a rather astonishing theoretical performance, because it raises all these questions, and they're raised by a theoretical inquiry, a theoretical investigation, which is acutely aware of the historical materialist basis of the theory that Marx is trying to build. It is an exercise in historical, and I'd like to say geographical materialism. And as such, it poses all these very interesting possibilities and problems. Yeah.
Yeah. This question is kind of in the same vein as what you're just talking about. I feel like I'm struggling to understand realization and production as it applies to the restaurant industry and like my work as a server. I'm having a hard time figuring out like how my labor turns into objectified labor, like especially in like front of house, like the food's already made. I'm just kind of bringing it out. And in the United States, I'm not really being paid for my labor by the restaurant owner. So I'm just curious about, you can help me figure out how to get there with Marx's words in terms of restaurant work.
Well, restaurants produce a product, which is a meal. They also provide an experience, so there's an experiential side to it. So you know, and then there are workers who are both producing the product and delivering the product. So chefs in the kitchen and busboys and then the waiters and so on. It's an employment structure, and there is an ownership somewhere. Sometimes it's individual family owned restaurant, maybe a chain, in which case is a manager and not an owner. And the manager will presumably price the food and the payments in such a way as to come out with a profit, right? And if you can say, all right, I don't pay the waiters, they just have to live on tips or something. Great, you don't have to pay, you know, you get more profit. At some point or other, workers go on strike and refuse to do that, and then they'll cut into profits if they are unable to raise prices. But what's astonishing to me is that to the degree that I eat out these days is restaurant prices seem to just gone bizarre. And I think that actually this is a pretty opportunistic thing, because I think most restaurant owners see everybody else is doing it, so they're going to do it too. So all of them are looking for higher profits, and they're using this as an opportunity to profiteer if they possibly can. At the same time, as they're hoping for unemployment, widespread unemployment, so that the more widespread the unemployment, the lower the wages can be, because you can always fire somebody and get somebody cheaper. So that's where class struggle goes on, and the nature of class struggle. So I think that what Marx would do is take any sector like that and say, what does it produce? What are the labor relations involved? What kinds of divisions of labor are involved in the process? What pay scales do you want to establish? There will be a managerial pay scale. There will be a chef, presumably, who will get something. So I think you can just analyze as a capitalist enterprise in competition with other capitalist enterprises. Which means that, yes, you can, if everybody's raising their prices, you can raise your prices too. But you might, if by keeping them low, you might actually find people who discriminate more in terms of prices. Will come to your place because it's cheaper and still as good quality as it was before. So this is how you would go about it. But it is interesting, again, you look at the history of the restaurant business. And in many parts of the world, since 1980s, there's been a very significant growth in the restaurant business, with a lot of ethnic restaurants and specializations going on. Kind of, yeah.
Thank you. I'm thinking about mass incarceration, and I recently have heard several analyses put forward that one of the driving factors behind the boom in incarceration in the United States was surplus labor. That the sort of the end of the post World War II boom left the United States with surplus labor forces that they could not employ. I guess I have a two-part question. I'm wondering if you find merit in those analyses, and I'm also wondering if you think there are any compelling connections between that and the emergence of, say, the labor market in China or these other foreign labor markets in the 1980s.
One of the things I take from Marx is to be very aware, very beware of single-shot explanations. And while what you're talking about may have played a role, I'm not, deep enough into the weeds of exactly what was going on to be able to give you a clear example. To be sure, there is a problem about the Industrial Reserve Army. How does it live? What does it live by? If it cannot live by some, respectable means, the Industrial Reserve Army is likely to resort to all manner of illegal means, if you like. And I think that to the degree that drug dealing, in my experience of it in the city of Baltimore, in the 1960s, 1970s, there were good blue-collar jobs in everything from car manufacture, Westinghouse, steel, and the job structure was, but all of that was destroyed by deindustrialization, which left a lot of people with no options. And one of the things that came along was the crack epidemic came along, and the organization of drug dealing in the city became a very, very significant side of the economy in ways that was not there in the 1960s. So you've got all of those kinds of things playing in. If you look at a television series like The Wire, it's situated very much on that cusp of what was occurring in the wake of deindustrialization in the city. And I think, so there are things of that sort that need to be looked at. And again, it's a good research topic. So the ball is in your court. Sorry, you had a...
Hi. I was just, what you were speaking about, the kind of ongoing crisis and the phenomenon of ongoing contradiction within capital. I also was thinking about the tangential rate of profit to fall. And I'm sorry, I had another note that I was taking here. Yeah, and the continuous devaluation of commodities. But I was thinking also, like, capital just keeps rebounding itself. And I think it's because, like you said, of its ability to flood the market with liquidity and, all these different things. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the tangential rate of profit.
Yeah, maybe I should have emphasized a bit more than I did in the account here that crises are almost embedded in the system, in other words. The way I would put it is this, that conventional economics rests on the idea that the market tends to create an equilibrium, that it comes together in an equilibrium. Things go wrong because of external shocks, like COVID or whatever, and so things need to change in that dynamic. But the market is inherently
going towards equilibrium. Marx works on the basis of contradiction, which is not about equilibrium, it's about disequilibrium. In Marx's work, you hit equilibrium by accident, and you don't stay there very long. Processes take you into disequilibria. And when the disequilibria get so big and so large, contradictions, then something has to give and you get a crash like 2007, 2008, like you did in the 1930s. We might be headed into a mini one right now. It's a kind of one of that sort. So what Marx actually what his theory suggests is there are two ways in which you depart from equilibrium. One is what he calls a monotonic divergence, which is you go away from equilibrium kind of on a steady line, and the other is a kind of oscillatory one where you're going like this, and you've got wave-like departures, and the waves are very small at the beginning, and they get larger and larger and bigger until in the end they crash down. So that's the way Marx tends to think of things. So the crises become the way in which capital stabilizes itself. And Marx is very clear about that. Many people think crises signal the end of capitalism. Marx kind of says, well, there could be one at the end of capitalism, but right now the role of crises is to bring you back to a situation which is a bit closer to equilibrium so that the system can function in a reasonably non-contradictory way. The contradictions, however, pick up. For instance, I think one of the big contradictions right now has been the suppression of wage levels and the suppression of workers' movements and all the rest of it, to such a point that there's no room for strong, effective demand other than that which is fueled by debt and credit cards and public debt as well. So one of the things that Roosevelt argued way back when was that we have to somehow or other get consumption back. And we can do it two ways. One is by actually supporting unionization. So in the Roosevelt period, you supported unionization because that meant that wages were likely to go up, effective demand was likely to go up, and capitalists would have a market to sell to. So a strong union movement was considered a good, positive thing. Good union contracts was considered a good, positive thing, and it stabilized things right throughout the 1960s. It then got destabilized by the attack upon labor since 1970s, and we've now gone in the other direction, where the contradiction is that where's your market going to be, and increasingly it's in being taken up by the state, but increasingly it's becoming debt peonage conditions for much of the working people. And that is not sustainable, and we're likely to see a working out of that, and we're beginning to see sort of some of the problems that are attached to that. I mean, the idea, as we saw in this cyber currency FTX, where somebody can start from almost nothing and end up with about $40 billion in their pockets within that is kind of way out of. This is the crashing sound, and of course that one came crashing down, and a lot of people have lost money by it, and there's a lot of devaluation going on right now, and there's a certain amount of devaluation going on in the California and New York banks, and what they're doing right now is let them support and not let the devaluation hit the consumers. Because if the devaluation hits the consumers, the consumerism will crash totally, and we will find ourselves in a deep depression very shortly if you had allowed what had happened to the consumers in those two banks to continue.
Any other questions?
there was a part, I can't find it, where he says that it posits the barrier ideally, but does not really overcome it, or overcomes it really, but does ideally, but doesn't really overcome it. And I'm thinking about the SVB situation right now, and the fact that it looks like treasury bonds aren't a safe bet anymore, where once it was considered the safest bet, right? And it raises sort of questions about this capacity to just print money in response to crisis. And I am thinking about whether that kind of, what has been the kind of response for the last kind of couple of decades is itself, running out as a possible solution, and what your thoughts are on that, and what could be next.
I would. Treasury bonds are still viable and very secure. That's not the problem. The problem is the interest rate that which they require, and that we know changes anyway. And the problem, if you like, was that people were in an environment where they'd never seen sharp moves in interest rates. The interest rate back in the late 1970s, early 1980s was, I don't know, 14 or 15%. I remember we borrowed something on a cheap interest rate, which was 11% at the time. But treasuries are still treasuries, and they have the backing of the U.S. economy, and as far as the validity of the treasuries, so they're still there. What was stupid on the part of the banks was that they thought they would still be there forever, and didn't do due diligence on the fact that the interest rate is going to move. So I don't think it's a problem of the. Now, something that is posited ideally. Well, in a way, that's exactly it. When I used the passage, I said money is a claim on future labor. And debt, of course, is a claim on future labor, big time. So what debt does is to postpone the encounter of capital with living labor. If it doesn't materialize, then you've got bankruptcy on your hand and you've got devaluation on your hands. So one of the roles of credit is, of course, to roll over debts, so that you continue to hold the debt, and that debt is a secure form of savings. So if I have savings in treasury bonds, what happens is that of course the value of the bond goes down if I want to sell it in the market. On the other hand, the interest rate I receive on holding the bond goes up. So they're balancing each other. So as long as I don't sell it, I'm going to get a higher interest rate. Right? Whereas if I sell it, I'm going to lose. Their problem was they needed the liquidity. They didn't have the liquidity. They had to sell, and when they were selling. So the treasury bonds were perfectly fine. If they could hang on to them, it would have been all right. But they couldn't. They had to sell them, and they had to sell them at a cut loss, because that's what, because the interest rate was going up, which is what the Federal Reserve was doing. what is interesting to me was how surprised the Federal Reserve seemed to be that something like this happened, which comes back again to the whole kind of issue of how much policymakers understand about the totality, and how you imagine that somehow or other, oh, you've got a problem called inflation, you can raise the interest rates and that deals with inflation. End of story. But one of the reasons that Marx is so tedious in his writings is that everything relates to everything else and everything connects to everything else, and he connects everything to everything else. So Marx would not be at all surprised that this sort of thing happened. In fact, he would sort of, and good Marxist economists would also have a good idea this was going to happen. Anybody else?
Any other questions? We have time for maybe one or two more.
There's one way back there somewhere. What's that?
Maybe not. Okay, David.
Okay.
Then maybe.
All right, good. So thank you. Next week, we're back into the center of the theoretical argument. But there's a good deal of history. So in a sense, it's about the history of capital.